Hello everyone. So this is Roger Yates and Neville. We're waiting for the VIP Vegan Information Project Inc. as always before the football. Now I'm going to talk to you once again about veganism. When I went vegan in the late 70s, the Vegan Society was about 35 years old. Now, you know, still not 100 years old obviously. And we're talking about 1944 when the first Vegan Society was formed. Now, 1944 is the last year but one of the Second World War. So the people who formed the Vegan Society were doing a fairly kind of radical thing. You know, Donald Watson famously was a conscientious objector, for example. So, you know, those of you who kind of listened to or watched any of my videos before and seen my blog entries will know that I'm rather concerned about developments within the movement. Now, I'm interested in social movements academically. I've read and taught social movement theory, for example, but I'm concerned about the current state of the movement, and it seems to me that there's various pressures at the moment to reduce the meaning of veganism to suit some agendas, and they're basically kind of reducetarian kind of ideas, whether it be reducing veganism to a diet or just about food, or reducing kind of more common idea, you know, for the animals type veganism. But it's kind of like for the animals type of veganism, for the animals only, nothing else. Why can't the other animals have their own movement? Why do we have to bring in other issues? I think this is a kind of misreading of what veganism is about, because it was always an entangled situation. If you go back to the founders of the Vegan Society, or as I tend to put it, the vegan movement, and perhaps I need to say the British or the European vegan movement, we're talking about people in the 1940s and 50s who came together as a political act and for the first time developed a social movement, or at least a social movement organization. And they came up with a name for it, which was vegan. And so the Vegan Society was born. And eventually, after a rather chaotic start, we have now a functioning social movement called the vegan movement, and the people in it are part of the vegan community. Now, I think some vegans don't necessarily see themselves as campaigners, or even maybe don't see themselves as part of a social movement, whereas I do. I think of veganism as a social movement, and therefore the Vegan Society is a social movement organization within it. It was the founding social movement organization of the vegan social movement. Now, it seems to me that the values of the founders of this European British vegan social movement are important, and as I've said repeatedly in the past, it's not that their views are law, it's just that they are the founders of our movement. And so I think therefore that any discussion and any definition, any exposition of the notion of veganism should at least acknowledge what their vision was. And their vision was larger and more radical than most vegans that I know currently, and most vegan views that you see, whether it be the reducetarians proper, you know, the so-called vegan strategists and all this, or whether it's the new YouTube superstars. All have got a rather impoverished idea of veganism. I saw a video the other day featuring Paul Bashir. He seems to have a very scant grasp of what veganism is, and it seems to me that there's a lot of people now who want to forge veganism in the way that they want it to be, ignoring what it meant for, say, people in my generation and the generation before that, the real genuine kind of founders of the movement, if you like. Now, I think this is an issue because veganism is a very big, radical idea, and I think it's worth saving. And it shouldn't be slimmed down for business reasons or for ideological reasons. And I think there's a lot of people now in the movement who just don't see veganism in the way that my generation does, which were, I mean, let me use the dread word. The kind of veganism that I'm used to would be called pro-intersectional in nature. In other words, a blend of human rights, animal rights, environmental concerns, and in the very early pioneers, even concerns about things like the earth's soil and woodlands and those kind of things, habitat, those kind of issues. So we talked about a kind of worldwide global idea, and part of the vision of the founders was that a vegan mindset would bring about a radical change for humanity. And I've characterized that as them talking about, and Leslie Cross talks about this directly, about the kind of moral evolution of humanity. And there's a good quote that I've used before where he talks about a second great aim or second aspect of veganism being about humanity. But if you look at the statements of the founders of the vegan social movement, the British European vegan social movement, then you're looking at people who saw the connections and saw the fact that we needed to bring about a new mindset, which was forged for them, of course, at the time of a world war. And they'd seen all kinds of suffering. The nuclear bombs were just about to go off, and all kinds of stuff was going on in terms of humanity. The Holocaust, mass genocide, mass killing, and they thought we're going to have to do something here, and we need a new radical vision of our place in the world. And their radical vision of our place became known as veganism. It wasn't about diet, although it involves the diet. It wasn't about lifestyle, although it involves lifestyle. They forged amongst themselves, in a bit of a chaotic manner, a philosophy of life which they thought would literally save human beings. By liberating other animals, we would save the planet and we would save ourselves. They saw it as being that important. Now, another aspect that I wanted to talk about on this occasion is the fact that on a couple of occasions I've kind of run into a problem. I've been called a racist, and this is because I tend to quote the particular people in England who founded the first vegan society or the vegan social movement in Britain and Europe, say. Now, they were all English and they were all white. Now, frankly, there's nothing I can do about that. Now, I'm not saying that these people were the first to talk about what we would regard as veganism. What I'm saying very clearly and repeatedly is that I'm talking about people who came together in a political act to form a social movement. They were the first to do it. They are the founders. If we think of ourselves as part of a social movement, they are the founders of our social movement. And yes, they're all white. And yes, they're all European. And that's not saying that there weren't other people having the same kind of thoughts all over the place. Right? That's not what's being said. I'm just talking about the people who actually founded a social movement, got it together to get together and do it, call it veganism, and proceed from there. And again, to repeat myself a third time, in a pretty chaotic way in the end. And I think Leslie Cross, I think the history of veganism will say that Leslie Cross played a big part, along with Dorothy Watson, Donald Watson, and Arthur Ling, Shirley Shrigley, Elsie Shrigley, sorry. So there is a group of people who came together in a political act to form this movement. of ours. Now, I can't help the fact that they're all white. Now, the latest allegation against me was based on the time when they were writing, and therefore the time when I was quoting them. In other words, the 1940s and the 1950s. I was accused of being oppressive towards people of colour because in those days there was segregation in the United States of America. Now, I'm a bit dumbfounded by that, because if you pick out any time in history and look around the globe, you're going to find that it was a time of great oppression for a great many groups of people. So I just don't, I mean, it's absurd. I don't understand how quoting Europeans from the 40s and the 50s can be oppressive to people living in the States now, because those times, the 1940s and 50s, was a time of, bad discrimination, inequality, which still goes on, let's face it, in the States. I don't understand that. So I tried to kind of figure out what I could do about that, in the sense that, should I, because I was in the habit of talking about the founders of the vegan social movement, and maybe, as I've done in this video, I should be saying the founders of the British and the European social movement, something like that, just to make sure that I was, all these white people, I was kind of like geographically situating them, if you like. There is also a problem about the language they use, in the same way as a problem about all kinds of language that people used writing in the past. Other animals were called it. Humanity was called man, and all the early founders of the vegan movement talked about man to mean humanity. There's a problem there. So, we do have speciesist, sexist, ableist, I mean, Tom Reagan uses words like retard, but I mean, everyone is a product of their time. I mean, okay, I'm an academic. You don't need to be an academic to understand that people are a product of their time, do you? Do you need that? Do you need an academic training to figure out that when people are writing in the 1940s, they're a product of those times and the values? And even though the founders of the European vegan movement were very radical, they weren't totally liberated from their entire culture. They didn't make a total break, in the sense that nobody is really. That a lot of people who regard themselves, self-identify as radicals, and scratch below the surface, and you find there's a rather conventional person there in terms of their core values, or some of them. People don't cast it all off at once, I mean, kind of give these people a break, and so I'd be interested to know what I can do, because I am very sad and I'm devastated by the idea that people would think that because I quote white people, I'm a racist. And I repeatedly quote them. And it's not because they're the most important voices, but they are the founding voices in this particular context. And maybe no other, but this is the context that I'm always talking about. So I'm bound to quote them because they're the ones who did it. I don't know what else I can't invent people as founders of a movement who weren't there. So I'm finding myself a little bit kind of stuck now, because I really care about the vegan movement, something I care very much about, which is why I'm almost like on constant alert for when people seem, from my point of view, to be either attacking it or undermining it, and at the moment slimming it down. I do have another video about the problem of the definition, and there is a real big problem when you've got a big revolutionary idea, and let's make no mistake, that's what veganism is. The definition doesn't cover everything. And I try to kind of get around this, if you like, or to explain this, in terms of focus and scope. So there are a lot of people who are very scared of pro-intersectionality, and they say we shouldn't take the focus off other animals. Well, veganism doesn't. That is the focus. Human relations with other animals is the focus, but it's not the scope. Now, I don't see why that is so threatening. People say, well, the animals deserve their own movement. Well, they have their own movement, but the scope of that movement is, you know, pro-intersectional or entangled with other issues. You know, we can't solve the issues that we want and bring about the kind of peaceful, respectful, rights-bearing world that we want in isolation. The human rights movement can't do it without us, and we can't do it without them. The idea that we can is ridiculous. And now, the tragedy at the moment is that we seem to have a lot of influential, Jurowski-inspired, angry plant eaters. And they are really kind of movers and shakers at the moment, but they don't really understand veganism in terms of its philosophical, you know, base idea. I wish they would, in the same way as ever. You know, wouldn't it be nice if people in the animal rights movement learnt a bit of animal rights theory so they could talk about animal rights? You know, there's been a couple of prominent videos lately just screaming out for somebody to say, actually, our position is based on animal rights. We regard other animals as rights bearers, and we regard what happens to them as rights violations. You know. Anyway, so that's it, I guess, really. I just, you know, in fact, I was talking to somebody on Facebook today, and I thought I'd try and make this video whilst waiting for the ink. And yeah, help me out. I mean, it's not wrong to talk about the founders of the vegan movement, surely, even if they were all in one country and they were all white. That just is a historical fact, and I'm not quite sure what you're supposed to do that, but I'm acknowledging that, you know, they're not the only ones to have these kind of thoughts, but we're talking about the people who actually did it. They formed it. They formed the movement that we are now in. They are the founders of our movement. And their grand vision, their expansive vision of peace, justice, non-violence is still important, and we shouldn't just jettison it because it suits us, and we certainly shouldn't do it because they were white. There's nothing we can do about that. Okay, folks, I'll see you again. Bye for now.